The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Promise Creek as Fiona Whitaker dove behind an overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't how she'd imagined starting her new life in the West, caught in the crossfire of a bank robbery gone wrong on her very first day in town. "Stay down, miss," a deep voice commanded as a tall figure slid into cover beside her, the brim of his hat pulled low over piercing eyes. Dust clung to his leather vest and the bandana at his throat, a stark contrast to her once pristine traveling dress, now soiled from the dirt road. "I had no intention of standing," Fiona replied, her Boston accent betraying her Eastern origins. Another bullet splintered the wagon wood above them, sending a shower of debris over her carefully pinned auburn hair. The stranger a cowboy, judging by his attire, and the worn spurs at his heels flashed her a brief grin before peering around the wagon's edge. "You picked a fine day to come to Promise Creek. Vincent Calloway, Deputy Marshal," he added, tipping his hat slightly. "And you are Fiona Whitaker." "I'm the new schoolteacher," she managed, flinching as more gunfire erupted. "Is this a regular occurrence in your town, Deputy Calloway?" "Call me Vince," he said, checking his revolver. "And no, madam, Promise Creek is usually peaceful as a Sunday sermon." His expression hardened. "Those are the Blackwater gang. They've been terrorizing the territory for months." Before Fiona could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air as the outlaws made their escape, bags of money tied to their saddles. Vince stood, holstering his weapon with a frustrated sigh. "Welcome to the West, Miss Whitaker," he said, extending a hand to help her up. "I'd apologize for your reception, but something tells me you're made of sterner stuff than most." Fiona accepted his hand, noting the calluses on his palm as she rose to her feet. "I certainly hope so, Deputy. I came out here for adventure, after all." His blue eyes caught hers, curious and measuring. "Adventure? Most folks come west for land or gold or to escape something back east." Fiona brushed the dust from her skirts, straightening her spine. "Perhaps I'm not most folks." "No," Vince agreed, a slow smile forming on his sun-weathered face. "I don't believe you are." Neither of them knew then how prophetic those words would prove, or how their lives would intertwine in the months ahead. But as Vince escorted Fiona to the schoolhouse that would become her home, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits meeting far from where either had begun. Promise Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878, was a town balanced on the edge of wilderness and civilization, much like its inhabitants. For Fiona Whitaker, 23 and determined to escape the suffocating expectations of Boston society, it represented freedom. For Vincent Calloway, 30 years old and haunted by a past he rarely spoke of, it was a chance at redemption. Neither expected to find love amidst the sagebrush and pine, but fate had other plans that would test them both beyond measure before the year was through. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building at the edge of town, with a small living quarters attached at the back. As Vince helped Fiona carry in her trunks, she surveyed what would be her new domain: rows of rough-hewn desks, a blackboard that had seen better days, and shelves lined with well-worn primers and readers. "It's not much," Vince said, setting down the last of her belongings. "Town council's been meaning to improve it, but funds are tight." "It's perfect," Fiona replied, running her fingers along the teacher's desk. "I can already see the possibilities." Vince watched her with curious eyes. "You're different from the last teacher." "Miss Primrose lasted exactly 3 weeks before declaring our children unteachable savages and catching the next stage east." Fiona laughed, the sound bright in the dusty room. "Well, I've taught in an orphanage in Boston's worst district for 4 years. I doubt your savages will shock me." "Don't be too sure," Vince warned, though his eyes crinkled with humor. "Hank Wilson's boy put a rattlesnake in Miss Primrose's desk drawer. Did he now?" Fiona's eyes sparkled with challenge rather than fear. Then Master Wilson and I shall have an interesting first conversation about respect and appropriate classroom behavior." Vince found himself studying her with growing admiration. Most Eastern women who ventured west were either desperate or deluded, arriving with trunks of impractical finery and notions about civilizing the frontier that rarely survived first contact with reality. But there was something different about Fiona Whitaker, a quiet determination that spoke of deeper waters. "I should let you get settled," he said, reluctantly moving toward the door. "School starts Monday," Fiona nodded. "I'll spend the weekend preparing. And perhaps you might direct me to the general store. I'll need supplies." "Better yet, I'll escort you myself after you've had a chance to rest," Vince offered. "Town's still unsettled after the robbery attempt. Besides, you should meet folks properly, not through gossip." "Is there much gossip about me already?" Fiona asked, arching an eyebrow. Vince's laugh was warm and genuine. "Miss Whitaker, a single woman traveling alone to take up a position previously held by 3 failed teachers in 8 months. You're the most interesting thing to happen to Promise Creek since Old Man Jenkins struck silver last spring." "Wonderful," she said dryly. "And please call me Fiona if we're to be friends." "Are we to be friends then?" Vince asked, his voice softening. Fiona met his gaze steadily. "I should hope so, Deputy. I know precious few people here, and you seem to be a decent sort, despite your obvious fondness for that atrocious hat." Vince's hand flew to his battered Stetson in mock offense. "This hat and I have been through hell and high water together, miss." "I'll not hear it slandered." Their laughter mingled in the afternoon light, the first notes of a melody neither yet recognized. True to his word, Vince returned that evening to escort Fiona to Jameson's general store. The main street of Promise Creek was a study in frontier architecture, false-fronted buildings lining a wide dirt road, hitching posts occupied by horses of varying quality, and the ever-present saloon whose piano music spilled into the gathering dusk. "That's the Rusty Nail," Vince explained, nodding toward the saloon. "Decent enough place if you don't mind the occasional brawl. Sheriff Porter and I only have to break up serious trouble about once a week." Fiona noted the fondness in his voice. "You sound almost disappointed by the lack of excitement." "Let's just say peacekeeping in Promise Creek isn't quite what I expected when I pinned on this badge," Vince admitted. "Though after today's excitement, I should be careful what I wish for." Inside Jameson's, Fiona was introduced to the proprietor, a jovial man with an impressive mustache, and his wife, whose shrewd eyes took in every detail of Fiona's appearance. "So you're our new schoolmarm," Mrs. Jameson said, not unkindly. "We're pleased to have you, though I should warn you that the children here are a bit spirited, so I've heard," Fiona replied. "Rattlesnakes in desk drawers and all." Mrs. Jameson laughed. "Oh, you've heard about Tommy Wilson already? Well, he's not the worst of them. The Donovan twins once convinced poor Miss Primrose that there was gold in the creek behind the school. Had her panning for hours in her Sunday best." As they spoke, other townsfolk entered the store, each finding some excuse to introduce themselves to the newcomer. Fiona met the blacksmith, the banker and his wife, the preacher, and at least a dozen mothers eager to size up the woman who would be teaching their children. Vince stood nearby, watching with quiet amusement as Fiona handled each introduction with grace and surprising wit. When Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, made a thinly veiled comment about Eastern women's delicate constitutions, Fiona responded with a story about breaking up a fight between 2 dock workers' sons that left the older woman speechless. "You've made quite an impression," Vince commented as they left the store, Fiona's purchases to be delivered the following day. "Good or bad?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Both, I think," he replied honestly. "They're not sure what to make of you yet. You're educated and refined enough to impress, but there's something else they can't quite place." "And what's that?" Vince considered her in the fading light. "Grit," he finally said. "You don't flinch, Miss Whitaker. Not from gunfire, not from rattlesnake stories, and not from Mrs. Henderson's disapproval, which has sent stronger souls running for the hills. Fiona smiled, a hint of sadness touching her eyes. Life teaches you not to flinch, Deputy, sometimes the hard way. There was a story there Vince realized one she wasn't ready to share. He respected that everyone in the West carried secrets. It was an unspoken rule not to pry too deeply into another's past. "May I see you safely home?" he asked instead. "I would appreciate that," she replied, her smile warming again. "Though I suspect the most dangerous thing I might encounter is town gossip about being escorted by the handsome deputy marshal." Vince felt an unexpected heat rise to his face at her casual compliment. "Let them talk," he said, offering his arm. "It'll give them something to do besides complaining about the drought." As they walked back toward the schoolhouse, the first stars appearing in the vast Wyoming sky, neither spoke much. It was a companionable silence, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the soft jingle of Vince's spurs. At her door, Fiona turned to him with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Deputy, for the rescue this morning and the introductions this evening." "Just doing my duty, madam," he replied, tipping his hat. Then, with a hint of uncertainty unusual for him, he added, "Perhaps you might join me for Sunday dinner after church. The hotel dining room serves a decent roast, and it would give you a chance to meet more of the townsfolk in a friendly setting." Fiona's smile brightened her entire face. "I'd like that very much." As Vince walked back toward town, he found himself whistling a tune he hadn't thought of in years, something his mother used to sing about springtime and new beginnings. He shook his head at his own foolishness. Fiona Whitaker was the town's schoolteacher, and he was simply doing his duty by helping her settle in. Nothing more. But as he glanced back at the schoolhouse, seeing lamplight glowing in the window, he couldn't help but wonder what stories lay behind those intelligent green eyes, and why she had really come all this way alone. The first day of school arrived with clear skies and nervous energy. Fiona stood on the schoolhouse steps, bell in hand, watching as children of all ages made their way toward her, some eager, others clearly reluctant, all curious about the new teacher from the East. She'd spent the weekend transforming the schoolroom, arranging wildflowers in jars, hanging maps she'd brought from Boston, and writing a welcome message on the blackboard. Her own nervousness was carefully concealed behind a composed exterior as she rang the bell to signal the start of the school day. 28 students filed in, ranging from 6-year-old Sally Perkins with her missing front teeth to 17-year-old Jim Donovan, whose hulking frame barely fit at his desk. Fiona took a deep breath and addressed her new charges. "Good morning. I am Miss Whitaker, and I am honored to be your teacher," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Before we begin with lessons, I'd like to tell you 3 things about myself. First, I believe every child deserves the gift of knowledge. Second, I expect your best effort, not perfection. And third," she paused, her eyes finding Tommy Wilson, a freckle-faced 10-year-old with a mischievous glint in his eye. "I am particularly fond of reptiles, having kept several as pets in Boston, including a rather impressive garter snake named Aristotle. So any wildlife that finds its way into this classroom will be treated as a welcome educational opportunity rather than a prank." A ripple of surprised whispers spread through the room. Tommy Wilson's mouth fell open, then closed with a snap as he reassessed the new teacher. "Now," Fiona continued with a smile, "I'd like each of you to stand and tell me your name, age, and something you enjoy learning about. Who would like to begin?" By midday, Fiona had assessed the varying educational levels of her students, separated them into appropriate groups, and begun establishing a routine that would allow her to teach multiple subjects simultaneously. It was challenging work, but not unfamiliar to someone who had taught in a crowded orphanage where resources were scarce. As the children filed out for lunch, Tommy Wilson lingered behind, scuffing his boot against the floorboards. "Miss Whitaker," he said hesitantly. "Did you really have a snake for a pet?" Fiona smiled. I did indeed. My father was a naturalist who studied all manner of creatures. He taught me that knowledge is the best cure for fear. Tommy considered this. My pa says you seem different from the other teachers. Is that good or bad? Fiona asked, echoing her question to Vince days earlier. Tommy shrugged. Dunno yet, but I like that you ain't afraid of snakes. He paused, then added reluctantly, I'm sorry about putting that rattler in Miss Primrose's desk. Pa tanned my hide good for that. As he should have, Fiona replied firmly. That was dangerous for both Miss Primrose and the snake, but I appreciate your apology and I hope we can start fresh. Tommy nodded solemnly before dashing outside to join his friends. The rest of the day proceeded with the expected hiccups of any first-day spilled ink, mispronounced words, and the inevitable testing of boundaries. But by the time Fiona rang the dismissal bell, she felt cautiously optimistic. These children weren't so different from those she'd taught in Boston. They simply needed consistency, clear expectations, and someone who believed in their potential. As the last student departed, Fiona sank into her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She was so absorbed in reviewing her notes for the next day that she didn't notice the figure in the doorway until he cleared his throat. Survived day one, I see, Vince said, leaning against the doorframe with an easy smile. Fiona looked up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Deputy Calloway, to what do I owe this visit? Has there been another bank robbery requiring my assistance? Thankfully not, he replied, entering the classroom. Just thought I'd check how our new schoolmarm fared with Promise Creek's finest young hooligans. They're not hooligans, Fiona corrected, though her tone was light. They're bright, curious children in need of guidance and stimulation, even Tommy Wilson. Especially Tommy Wilson, Vince agreed. That boy's too smart for his own good. His father works sunrise to sunset at the sawmill just to keep food on the table since his mother passed last winter. Doesn't leave much time for proper supervision. Fiona's expression softened. I didn't know, that explains some things. Most of these kids have similar stories, Vince said, gesturing to the empty desks. Life out here isn't easy, parents working long hours, some families struggling after bad harvests or mining accidents. School's a luxury, really? Not a luxury, Fiona corrected firmly. A necessity. Education is their path to choices, to futures beyond what circumstance has dealt them. Vince studied her with that same curious intensity he'd shown when they first met. You really believe that? With all my heart, she replied. It's why I became a teacher. A moment of understanding passed between them, deep and unexpected. Then Vince straightened, as if remembering himself. Well, I should let you finish up here. Just wanted to make sure you hadn't fled back east after meeting your students. Fiona's laugh filled the schoolroom. It will take more than 28 energetic children to scare me away, Deputy. Much more. Good to hear, he said, tipping his hat. And our Sunday dinner still stands. I'm looking forward to it, she confirmed. As promised, Vince escorted Fiona to dinner after Sunday services, where she charmed most of the congregation with her genuine interest in their lives and community. Over roast beef and potatoes at the hotel's dining room, they were joined by Sheriff Porter, a weathered man in his 50s, and his wife Martha, along with the young doctor, Franklin Reed, and several other prominent citizens. We're planning the Founders' Day celebration for next month, Martha Porter explained as they ate. It's our biggest event of the year. There's a dance, contests, food from all over, everyone for 20 miles comes to town. It sounds wonderful, Fiona said. How can I help? The conversation turned to planning, with Fiona volunteering her students to prepare decorations and perhaps put on a short educational presentation. As she spoke, her passion and creativity evident, Vince found himself watching her with growing admiration. There was a vibrancy to Fiona Whitaker that seemed to awaken something long dormant in Promise Creek and perhaps in himself as well. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Each morning, Fiona taught her increasingly engaged students. Afternoons were spent grading papers, preparing lessons, or visiting families, something unprecedented from previous teachers. Evenings often brought Vince to her door with some small pretext. Updates on town safety, questions about school matters, or once, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. They weren't officially courting such a thing would raise eyebrows given her position, but the town wasn't blind to the attention the deputy marshal paid to the schoolteacher, nor to the way her eyes brightened whenever he appeared. "You're sweet on her," Sheriff Porter commented one evening as they made their rounds. "She's a fine woman," Vince replied noncommittally, eyes scanning the darkened street. "Didn't say she wasn't," Porter chuckled. "Just observing that you've taken to walking past the schoolhouse even when your patrol doesn't require it." Vince couldn't deny it. There was something about Fiona that drew him: her intelligence, her kindness, the hint of mystery in her past. But he had his own secrets, his own reasons for caution. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Women usually are," Porter agreed sagely. "But the good ones are worth the trouble." As autumn painted the surrounding hills with gold and crimson, the bond between Vince and Fiona deepened. They rode together on Saturdays, exploring the countryside around Promise Creek. He showed her his favorite spots: a hidden waterfall, a ridge overlooking the valley, an ancient pine where he'd carved his initials as a boy. "You grew up near here?" Fiona asked during one such ride, surprised by this revelation. Vince nodded, his expression momentarily distant. "My father had a small ranch about 30 miles north, sold it after my mother died. I was 14. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I lost my mother young as well." "What brought you all the way out here, Fiona?" he asked, the question he'd been holding back for weeks. "The truth this time?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching an eagle circle overhead. "Freedom," she finally said. "In Boston, my path was predetermined: marriage to a suitable man chosen more for his connections than his character, a life of social obligations and carefully monitored propriety. After my father died last year, the pressure increased. My aunt was determined to see me properly settled." "And teaching in a frontier town was your solution?" Vince asked, his tone gentle rather than judgmental. Fiona nodded. "I saw the advertisement in a newspaper. Teacher wanted in Wyoming territory. It seemed like Providence." She turned to him, her eyes earnest. "I wanted to use my education for something meaningful, not just as an ornament to make me a more attractive marriage prospect. I wanted adventure, yes, but also purpose." "And have you found it?" Vince asked, genuinely curious. Her smile was answer enough. "Every day in that classroom. Every time Tommy Wilson asks a thoughtful question or little Sally masters a new word." They rode in comfortable silence until Vince spoke again. "My father wanted me to be a rancher like him, follow in his footsteps, build on what he started." "What changed?" His jaw tightened. "The war. I enlisted in '64, served until Appomattox, came back different, couldn't settle to the quiet life he wanted for me." Fiona studied his profile, understanding there was more to the story pain he wasn't ready to share. "So you became a lawman instead?" "Seemed a good use for the skills I'd learned," he said with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Protecting people rather than harming them." In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted between them: a deeper understanding, a recognition of kindred spirits who had each, in their own way, defied expectations to forge their own paths. As they turned their horses back toward town, the setting sun bathed everything in golden light, including Fiona's auburn hair. Vince found himself wondering what it would be like to build a life with someone like her, someone who understood the value of choice and the cost of freedom. But such thoughts were premature. They both had responsibilities to the town, and Fiona's position as schoolteacher required propriety. Besides, there were parts of his past he'd never shared with anyone, shadows he wasn't sure she could accept. Still, as they rode side by side in the gathering dusk, possibility hung in the air between them, fragile as a spider's web, and just as intricate in its connections. The Founders' Day celebration arrived on a crisp October afternoon, transforming Promise Creek from a hard-working frontier town into a festival of color, music, and community pride. Bunting decorated the storefronts. Tables laden with food lined the main street, and a wooden platform had been erected for dancing later in the evening. Fiona's students presented their historical tableau to enthusiastic applause, each child proudly reciting facts about Wyoming Territory's development while dressed as pioneers, Native Americans, or historical figures. Even Tommy Wilson, cast as Mountain Man Jim Bridger, performed his part with unexpected poise. "You've worked miracles with these children," Martha Porter commented as Fiona watched her students disperse to enjoy the festivities. "Tommy's father says he's actually asking for books now instead of just fishing tackle." Fiona smiled, warmed by the validation of her efforts. They just needed someone to believe in them. As the afternoon progressed, Fiona participated wholeheartedly in the celebration, judging pie contests, cheering at the shooting competition, which Vince won handily, and even trying her hand at horseshoe pitching, much to the amusement of the townspeople. Vince found her just as musicians were tuning up for the evening dance. She'd changed from her practical teaching clothes into a dress of deep green that complemented her eyes and hair, which she'd arranged in a simpler style than her usual severe bun. "Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice catching slightly, "you look beautiful." A blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you, Deputy, you clean up rather well yourself." It was true he'd exchanged his usual working clothes for a pressed shirt, vest, and his least worn pair of trousers. He'd even trimmed his beard. "Would you honor me with the first dance?" he asked, offering his arm. "I'd be delighted," she replied, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. As they joined other couples on the dance floor, the musicians struck up a lively tune. Vince proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding Fiona with confidence through the steps of a Virginia reel. "Where did a frontier lawman learn to dance like this?" she asked, breathless, as they came together in the pattern. "My mother insisted," he replied, spinning her gently. "Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo." Fiona laughed, the sound carrying over the music and drawing smiles from those nearby. As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, pausing only to refresh themselves with punch or speak with townspeople who invariably commented on what a fine couple they made. "People are talking," Fiona murmured after overhearing one such remark. "People always talk," Vince replied. "Does it bother you?" She considered this as they swayed to a slower melody. "Not if it doesn't bother you." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "The only opinion that matters to me is yours." The intimacy of the moment was broken by a commotion at the edge of the celebration. Sheriff Porter appeared, making his way urgently toward them. "Vince," he called, "need you. Riders spotted heading this way. Could be the Blackwater gang." Vince's expression hardened immediately. "How many?" "5, maybe 6. Johnson saw them from the North Ridge." Vince turned to Fiona, regret in his eyes. "I have to go." "Of course," she said, trying to mask her concern. "Be careful." He squeezed her hand briefly before following Porter, pausing only to collect his gun belt from where he'd left it during the dancing. The celebration continued, though with a subdued edge as word spread about the potential threat. Fiona found herself unable to enjoy the remaining festivities, her thoughts with Vince and the danger he might be facing. An hour passed, then 2. The dancing wound down, families with young children beginning to head home despite the early hour. Fiona helped Martha Porter and the other women clear away food, her ears straining for any sound of returning horses or gunfire. When hoofbeats finally approached, the remaining townsfolk gathered anxiously. Sheriff Porter rode in first, followed by 2 local men who had volunteered to help. Vince came last, his expression grim, a bloodstain visible on his shirt sleeve. "It was them all right," Porter announced. They turned back when they realized we'd spotted them, exchanged some shots, but they retreated into the hills. Fiona pushed through the crowd to Vince's side as he dismounted. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for his arm. "Just a graze," he assured her, though he winced when she touched near the wound. "Bullet barely nicked me." "Let Dr. Reed look at it anyway," she insisted, her tone brooking no argument. As the crowd dispersed, reassured by the sheriff that the immediate danger had passed, Fiona accompanied Vince to the doctor's office. While Reed cleaned and bandaged the wound, she sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're angry," Vince observed once they were alone, the doctor having stepped out to retrieve more bandages. "Not angry," she corrected. "Frightened, there's a difference." "It's my job, Fiona," he said gently. "Protecting this town, protecting you is what I'm meant to do." She met his gaze directly. "I understand duty, Vince, but I've seen too many good men throw themselves needlessly into danger as if their lives matter less than others." There was something personal in her words that made him wonder. "Your father," Fiona nodded slowly. "He was a surgeon in the war. Volunteered though he was past the age of conscription. Saved countless lives on the battlefield but never quite recovered from what he saw. The man who came home was diminished. He died last year, but in many ways I lost him in 1863. Understanding dawned in Vince's eyes. "And you worry the same will happen to me?" "I worry about caring for a man whose first instinct is to ride toward danger rather than away from it," she admitted softly. Vince reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. "I can't promise never to face danger," he said honestly. "But I can promise never to seek it unnecessarily. I have too much to live for." The intensity in his gaze left no doubt as to his meaning. Something had shifted between them, the unspoken attraction now acknowledged, if not yet fully declared. Dr. Reed's return interrupted the moment, but the connection established remained, a current running beneath the surface of their interactions as Vince escorted Fiona back to her quarters later that evening. At her door, he hesitated, clearly wanting to say more but constrained by propriety and his own reticence. "Thank you for the dances," Fiona said, breaking the silence. Before the interruption, it was a lovely evening. It was, he agreed. Then, with careful deliberation, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Good night, Fiona." The simple gesture, so proper yet intimate, left her breathless. "Good night, Vince." As October gave way to November, the first snow dusted the mountains surrounding Promise Creek. The schoolhouse was cozy thanks to the new stove Vince had helped install, one of many improvements made since Fiona's arrival. The children brought extra firewood each morning, a system she'd implemented to ensure warmth throughout the day. Life fell into a pleasant routine, with Vince's visits becoming an expected part of Fiona's evenings. They would talk for hours about books, their childhoods, their dreams for the future, carefully avoiding the deeper personal revelations that had surfaced the night of the Founders' Day dance. Thanksgiving approached, bringing preparations for the town's communal feast. Fiona's students created decorations and practiced recitations expressing gratitude, while the women of Promise Creek planned an elaborate meal in the church hall. 2 days before the holiday, Vince arrived at the schoolhouse after hours with a troubled expression. "What's wrong?" Fiona asked immediately, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "Blackwater gang's been spotted again," he said, removing his hat as he entered. "They hit a stagecoach near Bitter Creek yesterday, 2 passengers wounded." Fiona's heart sank. The gang had been quiet since Founders' Day, and she'd hoped they'd moved on to other territories. "What does this mean?" "Sheriff's organizing a posse," Vince replied, unable to meet her eyes. "We ride out tomorrow at dawn." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. A posse meant extended pursuit, potentially for days, in hostile territory and worsening weather. "How long?" she asked simply. "As long as it takes," he answered. "But we hope to be back by Sunday if the weather holds and the trail doesn't go cold." Fiona nodded, turning away to hide the fear that threatened to overwhelm her composure. She'd known this day might come, had prepared herself for it intellectually, but the reality struck harder than expected. "Fiona," Vince said softly, moving closer. I'd stay if I could. No, you wouldn't, she replied without accusation. Nor would I want you to. Those men hurt innocent people. They need to be brought to justice. When she turned back to him, her expression was controlled again, though her eyes betrayed her concern. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise Creek needs its deputy marshal. Vince stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. And what about the schoolteacher? He asked, his voice low. What does she need? The question hung between them, charged with meaning. Fiona's breath caught as Vince reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The schoolteacher needs her deputy to return safely, she whispered. In that moment, the careful distance they'd maintained shattered. Vince leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that began tentatively but deepened as Fiona responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Vince rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day you arrived in Promise Creek. Even with dirt on my face and bullets flying overhead, she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. Especially then, he confirmed. You didn't scream or faint, you just looked irritated that someone had interrupted your arrival. Fiona laughed softly, the sound mingling with the crackle of the stove fire. I'm not the fainting type. No, he agreed, his hands still framing her face. You're extraordinary, Fiona Whitaker. And I fully intend to court you properly when I return. I'll hold you to that, Deputy Calloway, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. They parted that evening with another kiss and promises exchanged. As Fiona watched him walk back toward town, snow beginning to fall in gentle flakes around him, she offered a silent prayer for his safe return. The next morning, Fiona stood with other townspeople to see the posse off 8 men, including Vince and Sheriff Porter, well armed and provisioned for several days' pursuit. Vince's eyes found hers in the crowd, a private message passing between them before he touched his hat brim in farewell. The days that followed were among the longest of Fiona's life. She threw herself into teaching and Thanksgiving preparations, but her thoughts constantly strayed to Vince and the others, somewhere in the wilderness tracking dangerous men. The communal feast went ahead as planned, though subdued without the sheriff and deputy present. Fiona accepted an invitation to join the Porter's family table, where Martha's quiet strength provided comfort. The waiting is the hardest part, Martha said knowingly as they washed dishes afterward. Been doing it for 30 years with Robert, doesn't get easier. How do you bear it? Fiona asked. Faith, the older woman replied simply. In God, in Robert's good sense, and in the knowledge that loving a man means accepting all of him, including the parts that make your heart ache with worry. Sunday came with no word from the posse, then Monday. A storm moved in, blanketing Promise Creek in heavy snow that muffled sounds and isolated the town further. Fiona continued teaching, but even the children sensed her distraction. On Wednesday afternoon, as darkness fell early with the approaching winter solstice, a commotion at the edge of town drew Fiona from the schoolhouse. The posse had returned, men and horses exhausted, frost clinging to beards and saddles. Fiona's eyes scanned the group frantically, her heart stopping when she couldn't immediately locate Vince. Then the crowd parted, and she saw him slumped in his saddle, face pale beneath several days' growth of beard, but alive. She pushed forward as he dismounted stiffly, catching him when he swayed slightly on his feet. You're hurt, she said, noting how he favored his left side. Bruised ribs, he explained, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. Horse slipped on an icy slope, could have been worse. Sheriff Porter approached, his own face haggard but satisfied. We got them, he announced to the gathering crowd. All 5 members of the Blackwater gang captured near the territorial line. They're locked in the jail now, awaiting the circuit judge. A cheer went up from the townsfolk. Justice had been served, the territory would be safer now. But Fiona cared only that Vince had returned as promised. Let's get you warmed up, she said, supporting him as they walked slowly toward his small cabin behind the marshal's office. Inside, she built up the fire while Vince removed his snow-crusted outer garments. His movements were stiff, evidence of the hard ride and his injury. "I should fetch Dr. Reed," Fiona said, concerned by the lines of pain around his eyes. "Later," Vince replied, catching her hand as she turned to leave. "Just stay with me for a moment." She hesitated, aware of propriety but unwilling to leave him when he clearly needed her. Finally, she nodded, sitting beside him on the small sofa. "We followed them for 2 days through the mountains," Vince said after a while, staring into the flames. "Weather turned bad on the 3rd day, lost their trail twice. Porter was about to call it off when we spotted smoke from their campfire." He described the confrontation, a brief, violent exchange of gunfire before the outlaws surrendered, realizing they were outnumbered and outflanked. No one had been killed, though 2 of the gang members were wounded. "They'll hang," he said quietly. "They've killed at least 3 men that we know of during robberies." Fiona listened, understanding his need to process the events. When he fell silent, she simply took his hand in hers, offering comfort without words. "I thought of you," he finally said, turning to meet her eyes. "Every cold night, every difficult moment, the thought of coming back to you kept me going." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within her. "I'm glad," she whispered, "because I've thought of little else but your return since you left." This time when they kissed, there was a new urgency, a recognition of life's fragility and the precious nature of the connection between them. Vince pulled her closer, his hands tangling in her hair as the carefully constructed pins gave way. It was Fiona who finally pulled back, breathless and flushed. "You need rest," she said firmly, though her eyes betrayed her reluctance. "And Dr. Reed should look at those ribs." Vince sighed, acknowledging the wisdom of her words if not their appeal. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked. "After school?" "Yes," she promised, rising and straightening her disheveled hair. "Now I'm going to send the doctor to you and you're going to follow his instructions precisely." A smile tugged at Vince's mouth. "Yes, madam." At the door, she turned back to him, suddenly serious. "I'm proud of you, Vince. What you did was important and brave, but I'm even more grateful that you kept your promise to return." The days leading up to Christmas brought festive preparations to Promise Creek. The church and schoolhouse were decorated with pine boughs and handmade ornaments. Gifts were crafted or ordered from distant catalogs, and plans made for Christmas Eve services followed by a community gathering. Vince recovered quickly from his ordeal, his ribs healing and his spirits lifting as he spent more time with Fiona. They were now openly courting, much to the approval and occasional good-natured teasing of the townspeople. Several evenings a week, they could be seen walking together after dinner or sitting side by side at community events. On the last day of school before the Christmas holiday, Vince arrived to find Fiona's students presenting her with a handmade gift, a quilt with squares designed by each child, assembled by some of the mothers. "So you'll stay warm through the winter, Miss Whitaker," Sally Perkins explained earnestly. "Mama says Boston folk ain't used to Wyoming cold." Fiona accepted the gift with genuine emotion, especially touched by Tommy Wilson's square, which featured a surprisingly well-drawn snake with what appeared to be a teacher's pointer in its coils. "It's Aristotle," he explained proudly. "Your Boston snake. I figured he'd want to teach too." As the children filed out for the holiday, Vince approached Fiona, who was still admiring the quilt. "Looks like you've won them over completely," he observed. "They're wonderful children," she replied, carefully folding the precious gift. "I've learned as much from them as they have from me." "I have something for you too," Vince said, suddenly nervous in a way Fiona rarely saw him. "Though it can't compare to a class quilt." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Merry Christmas, Fiona." She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a book, its cover etched with a simple flower pattern. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her finger over the detailed metalwork. "Blacksmith Jenkins made it," Vince explained. "From my design, I thought." Well, it seemed to represent you, knowledge and beauty together. Fiona looked up at him, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. I'll treasure it, she said softly. And I have something for you as well, though you'll have to wait until Christmas Day. I look forward to it, he replied. Then, more hesitantly, I was hoping you might join me for Christmas dinner. Just the two of us at my cabin. I can't promise my cooking will match the hotel's, but I'd love to, she interrupted, her smile brightening the already cheerful schoolroom. Christmas Eve arrived with perfect winter beauty fresh snow covering the town in pristine white, stars brilliant in the clear night sky. The church service was well attended, with Fiona's students performing a nativity scene complete with Tommy Wilson as a surprisingly dignified Joseph. Afterward, the community gathered in the decorated church hall for hot cider, cookies, and caroling. Fiona, wearing Vince's brooch pinned to her best dress, found herself surrounded by people who had, in just a few months, become dear to her. The contrast to her previous Christmas in Boston formal, restrained, heavy with unspoken expectations couldn't have been more stark. Penny for your thoughts, Vince said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of cider. I was just thinking how different this Christmas is from my last, she replied, accepting the warm drink gratefully. How much happier I am here among these good people. With you, his eyes softened at her words. I've been thinking too, he said, guiding her to a quieter corner of the hall. About the future, our future specifically? Fiona's heart quickened at his tone. Have you? I know it's only been a few months, Vince continued, his usual confidence giving way to endearing uncertainty. And I'd understand if you think it's too soon. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of my feelings for you, Fiona Whitaker. Before he could continue, they were interrupted by Sheriff Porter calling for everyone's attention to announce the winners of the Children's Christmas Drawing Contest. The moment passed, but the meaning in Vince's eyes remained, a promise of a conversation to be continued. Christmas Day dawned bright and cold. Fiona spent the morning visiting Martha Porter and delivering small gifts to several of her students' families. By afternoon, she was knocking at Vince's cabin door, a wrapped package in her arms and anticipation fluttering in her stomach. The cabin was transformed. A small pine tree decorated with carved wooden ornaments stood in one corner, the table was set with Vince's best dishes, and delicious aromas filled the warm space. Merry Christmas, he greeted her, taking her coat and the package. You look beautiful. She wore a dress of deep crimson, her hair arranged in loose curls rather than her usual severe style, the silver brooch gleaming at her collar. Thank you, she replied, looking around appreciatively. You've gone to so much trouble. Nothing's too much for you, he said simply, leading her to the table where he'd prepared a feast of roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables preserved from the fall harvest. They ate and talked, sharing stories of childhood Christmases and traditions. Vince, it turned out, was a surprisingly good cook, having learned from necessity during his bachelor years. After the meal, they moved to sit before the fire, where Vince finally opened his gift, a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, and a book of Walt Whitman's poetry. There's an inscription, Fiona said as he turned the book over in his hands. Vince opened to the flyleaf, where Fiona had written in her neat teacher's hand. To Vince, who showed me that the greatest adventure is finding where one truly belongs. With love, Fiona. It's perfect, he said, genuinely moved. Both gifts, though I suspect you'll need to explain some of Whitman's more obscure verses to me. I'd be happy to, she replied with a smile. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Finally, Vince turned to her, his expression serious. I wasn't able to finish what I wanted to say last night, he began. About our future. Fiona nodded, her pulse quickening again. I'm listening now. Vince took her hand in his. When I came to Promise Creek 3 years ago, I was running from my past, from the memories of the war, from my father's disappointment. I wasn't looking to build anything lasting, just to do some good, keep the peace, maybe find some redemption along the way. He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Then you arrived, stubbornly refusing to be frightened by gunfire or rattlesnakes or even Mrs. Henderson's disapproval, and everything changed. Rising from the sofa, Vince knelt before her, still holding her hand. "I love you, Fiona Whitaker. Your courage, your intelligence, your compassion for your students, your willingness to seek adventure rather than security. I love all of it, all of you." From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band set with a modest pearl. "This was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to me before he died, hoping I'd find someone worthy of it someday." Fiona's eyes filled with tears as Vince continued. "I can't offer you Boston's refinement or an easy life. But I can promise to love you every day, to support your teaching, to build a life with you here in Promise Creek if you'll have me. Fiona Whitaker, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered without hesitation, joy illuminating her face. "Yes, Vincent Calloway, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears of happiness. "When?" Vince asked, still holding her close. "Spring," Fiona suggested, "after the school term ends. That would give us time to prepare, and the weather would be favorable for guests who might travel from back east." Vince nodded agreement, then kissed her again, simply because he could, because this remarkable woman had agreed to become his wife, to share her life with him in this frontier town they both now called home. Later that evening, as snow began falling again outside the cabin windows, they sat before the fire planning their future together, the house they would build, the life they would share, the family they hoped to create. Two people who had come to Promise Creek, seeking different things, but had found, in each other, the answer to questions they hadn't known they were asking. Winter passed in a haze of happiness for Fiona and Vince. News of their engagement spread quickly through Promise Creek, met with universal approval and no small amount of satisfied nodding from those who had predicted the match from the start. Fiona continued teaching, her students thriving under her guidance. Vince maintained law and order in the growing town, though the capture of the Blackwater gang had significantly reduced serious crime in the area. Together, they began planning their spring wedding and the construction of a small house on a plot of land Vince purchased at the edge of town, close enough for Fiona to walk to the schoolhouse, but with views of the mountains she had come to love. In late February, as the first hints of thaw began to appear in protected valleys, Fiona received a letter from her aunt in Boston. The older woman expressed shock at Fiona's hasty engagement to a frontier lawman, but grudgingly agreed to attend the wedding, if only to ensure you haven't completely lost your senses. "Will your aunt's disapproval be a problem?" Vince asked that evening as they sat in Fiona's quarters reviewing house plans. "Not at all," Fiona assured him. "Aunt Margaret disapproves of most things on principle. The fact that she's willing to travel all the way to Wyoming is actually quite remarkable. It means she's curious, which is better than outright rejection." "And what about your friends from Boston? The other teachers from the orphanage?" Fiona smiled, touched by his concern for her connections to her past life. "Clara and Beatrice have already written that they'll come if they can arrange leave from their positions. They're genuinely happy for me, Vince. They understand why I came west better than my family ever did." As March brought increasingly mild weather, construction began on their house, a modest but comfortable two-story structure with a wide porch and large windows to capture the mountain views. The men of Promise Creek pitched in, raising the frame in a community effort that reminded Fiona of stories she'd read about frontier barn raisings. With the wedding set for early June, preparations accelerated as spring fully arrived. Martha Porter and the other women helped Fiona plan the details, from her dress, ordered from a Denver dressmaker, to the reception, to be held in the church hall and spilling onto the adjoining grounds if weather permitted. In mid-May, as wildflowers carpeted the surrounding hillsides, Fiona's aunt and friends arrived from Boston, wide-eyed at the rugged beauty of Wyoming territory and the rustic character of Promise Creek. "So this is where you've chosen to build your life," Aunt Margaret said critically as Fiona showed her around the town. "It's primitive. It's home," Fiona replied simply. "The people here are good and honest. They value education for their children, they help each other in times of need, and they've welcomed me as one of their own." Her aunt's expression softened slightly as she observed the genuine affection with which townspeople greeted her niece. "And this deputy marshal of yours, he treats you well." "Better than I ever dreamed possible," Fiona assured her. "Vince respects my independence and my teaching. He values my thoughts and my dreams. We're true partners, Aunt Margaret." The older woman harumphed, but there was less disapproval in the sound than before. "Well, I suppose that's more than many marriages can claim, even in the best Boston society." 2 weeks before the wedding, disaster struck. A spring storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing torrential rain that swelled the creek running through town to dangerous levels. Vince and Sheriff Porter organized evacuation of the lowest-lying buildings, including the jailhouse where 3 prisoners were being held for minor offenses. Fiona was helping Martha Porter coordinate shelter for displaced families in the church when a mudslide hit the north side of town, destroying 2 homes and damaging several others. Word spread quickly that people were trapped, and every able-bodied man raced to help with rescue efforts. Hours later, as darkness fell and rain continued to pound the saturated ground, Fiona paced anxiously in the church hall, watching the door for any sign of Vince. Most of the trapped townspeople had been rescued, but reports were confused and contradictory about who remained at the site and what progress was being made. Just before midnight, the church door burst open, admitting several mud-covered men carrying a stretcher. Fiona's heart stopped when she recognized Vince's form lying motionless on the canvas. "He's alive," Sheriff Porter assured her quickly, seeing her expression. "But he's hurt bad. Part of the Wilson house collapsed while he was helping get the children out." Dr. Reed immediately directed them to place Vince on a table he'd prepared for treating injuries. Fiona rushed to Vince's side, horrified by his pale face and the blood matting his hair. "He took a beam to the head and shoulder," Reed explained as he cut away Vince's shirt to reveal massive bruising. "Possible concussion, broken collarbone for certain. We need to watch for internal injuries." Fiona nodded numbly, her teacher's composure taking over as she assisted the doctor, cleaning wounds and applying bandages as directed. When Reed had done all he could, he stepped back with a grave expression. "The next 24 hours are critical," he told Fiona privately. "The head injury concerns me most. He hasn't regained consciousness, which isn't a good sign." "What can I do?" she asked, refusing to give in to the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "Stay with him. Talk to him. Watch for fever that could indicate infection. If his temperature rises significantly or if he shows signs of seizure, call for me immediately." Fiona nodded, settling into a chair beside the makeshift examination table where Vince lay. The doctor had deemed it too dangerous to move him to more comfortable quarters until they were certain of his condition. Through the night, Fiona sat vigil, bathing Vince's face with cool water, speaking softly to him about their plans, their future, anything to reach through the unconsciousness that held him. Martha brought her tea and tried to convince her to rest, but Fiona refused to leave his side. As dawn approached, Vince's skin grew hot to the touch, his breathing more labored. Fever had set in the complication Reed had feared most. "Get the doctor," Fiona instructed Tommy Wilson, who had been helping bring supplies. The boy ran off immediately, returning minutes later with Reed in tow. The next day passed in a blur of desperate measures, cold compresses, herbal remedies, and prayers as Vince's fever climbed steadily higher. By evening, he was delirious, occasionally mumbling incoherently or calling out as if still on the battlefield he'd left behind years ago. Fiona refused all suggestions that she rest, maintaining her position at his side, talking to him constantly, reminding him of their love, their plans, all they had yet to accomplish together. "You promised me a future, Vincent Calloway," she whispered fiercely as she bathed his burning face. "And I'm holding you to that promise. Fight this. Come back to me." Night fell again, bringing no improvement. Dr. Reed's expression grew increasingly concerned as he checked Vince's vital signs. "The fever's dangerously high," he admitted to Fiona, "if it doesn't break soon." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Fiona understood the implications all too well. Infection could kill as surely as any bullet, and Vince's strong constitution was being severely tested by this unseen enemy. "What else can we try?" she asked, desperation edging into her voice. Reed hesitated. "There's a treatment more extreme than what we've attempted. Ice packs, if we can get enough ice. It might help lower his temperature, but it's not without risks." "Do it," Fiona said without hesitation, "whatever it takes." The men of Promise Creek organized a team to collect ice from the still frozen ponds in the higher elevations nearby. By midnight, they returned with enough to implement Reed's treatment. Vince was packed in ice, his already shivering body now racked with more violent tremors that tore at Fiona's heart. "Talk to him," Reed encouraged as they worked. "Give him something to focus on, to fight for." Fiona leaned close to Vince's ear, her voice steady despite her fear. "Remember our first meeting? How you told me to stay down during the bank robbery? I knew then that you were someone special, someone who would protect others without a second thought." She continued, recounting their shared memories, their dreams for the house being built, the life they had planned together. "Our wedding is in 12 days, Vince. 12 days, and I expect you to be standing at that altar, do you understand? You don't get to leave me now, not when we've only just found each other." The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Fiona refused all offers of respite, maintaining her position at Vince's side, alternately praying, talking, and simply holding his hand as the battle for his life continued within his fevered body. As the clock struck midnight on the second night of his illness, Fiona felt a subtle change. Vince's breathing seemed less labored, his skin not quite as scorching to the touch. She placed her palm on his forehead, hardly daring to hope, then reached for his wrist to check his pulse as Reed had shown her. Vince's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing as they found her face. "Fiona?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "I'm here," she replied, tears of relief streaming unchecked down her face. "I'm right here, Vince." She pressed her hand to his forehead again, confirming what she already knew: the burning heat had diminished significantly. The fever had broken. "Your fever broke at midnight," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be all right." Vince's cracked lips curved into a faint smile. "You made it, sweetheart," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "You brought me back." Dr. Reed, summoned by a vigilant Tommy Wilson who had also refused to leave, confirmed what Fiona already knew: the crisis had passed. Though Vince was still weak and would require time to heal completely, the worst danger was behind them. "You'll still make it to your wedding," Reed assured them both with a smile. "Though you might need to lean on a cane, Deputy." The news spread quickly through the church hall, where many townspeople had maintained their own vigil, praying for the deputy marshal who had risked his life to save others. A spontaneous cheer erupted, startling Vince and bringing fresh tears to Fiona's eyes as she realized just how deeply he was valued by the community they both served. Recovery was slow but steady. Within days, Vince was strong enough to be moved to his cabin, where Fiona propriety temporarily set aside with Aunt Margaret's reluctant blessing took charge of his care. His broken collarbone would take weeks to heal fully, but his head injury proved less severe than initially feared once the fever subsided. "You know," Vince commented one afternoon as they sat on his porch enjoying the spring sunshine, "most men don't get to see their bride's nursing skills before the wedding." Fiona smiled, adjusting the sling supporting his injured shoulder. Consider it a preview of in sickness and in health. Though I'd prefer if you limited the sickness part in the future. No more heroics, he asked, his good hand capturing hers. Oh, I expect heroics are part of who you are, she replied. Just perhaps with a bit more caution thrown in, I've grown rather attached to having you in one piece. As the wedding date approached, Vince's strength returned. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held in the church where they had weathered both celebration and crisis together. Fiona wore the dress from Denver ivory satin with delicate lace that her aunt declared surprisingly tasteful for frontier fashion. Vince stood straight and proud, needing the cane Dr. Reed had predicted, but otherwise showing few signs of his recent brush with death. Sheriff Porter stood as Vince's best man, while Clara, Fiona's friend from Boston, served as maid of honor. Tommy Wilson, beaming with importance, carried the rings on a small cushion sewn by his father. When Vince spoke his vows, his voice carried throughout the packed church, clear and unwavering. I, Vincent Calloway, take you, Fiona Whitaker, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. Here he paused, a meaningful glance passing between them, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. Fiona's response was equally firm, though those who knew her best could detect the slight tremor of emotion in her voice. The celebration afterward was everything Promise Creek could offer, tables laden with food prepared by every household, music from local fiddlers, dancing, though Vince was limited by his healing injuries, and genuine good wishes from a community that had embraced them both. As evening fell and lanterns illuminated the church grounds, Vince led Fiona away from the festivities toward their newly completed house. Though they had both seen it during construction, this was their first visit since the finishing touches had been completed, a surprise organized by the townspeople during Vince's recovery. Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway, Vince said softly as they approached the porch, where someone had hung a wreath of spring wildflowers on the front door. Inside, they found the house fully furnished with a mixture of pieces from Vince's cabin, items Fiona had brought from Boston, and wedding gifts from the community. A fire had been lit in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the main room. On the mantel stood a framed photograph of them together, taken just after their engagement by a traveling photographer who had passed through Promise Creek. It's perfect, Fiona whispered, taking in the care and thought evident in every detail. Not quite, Vince replied, setting aside his cane to take her in his arms despite his still healing shoulder. Now it's perfect. As they stood in the center of their new home, the sounds of celebration still faintly audible from the town, both recognized the journey that had brought them to this moment, from their first meeting amidst gunfire to the crisis that had nearly separated them forever. They had found in each other not just love, but partnership, respect, and a shared vision for their future in this frontier community they both now called home. I love you, Vincent Calloway, Fiona said, her green eyes bright with happiness and promise. And I love you, Fiona Calloway, he replied, sealing the words with a kiss that held all the tenderness, passion, and commitment that would sustain them through the years ahead. In the decades that followed, Promise Creek would grow from a frontier settlement into a proper town, with Fiona Calloway's school expanding to a 2-story building with multiple classrooms. Vince would eventually become sheriff after Porter's retirement, continuing to maintain peace and justice in the community they both served with unwavering dedication. Their home on the edge of town would fill with the laughter of 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son who would grow up knowing the value of education, courage, and community. The annual retelling of how their father had been rescued from fever by their mother's determination became a family tradition, along with the phrase that had marked his return to health, "You made it, sweetheart." And on quiet evenings, long after their children were grown and had families of their own, Vince and Fiona would still sit together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Their hands intertwined in a bond that had been forged in the crucible of frontier life and tempered by shared joys and sorrows into something unbreakable and enduring. For in coming to Promise Creek, they had each found what they sought: Fiona her adventure and purpose, Vince his redemption and peace. But more importantly, they had found in each other the courage to build a life defined not by the expectations of others, but by the dreams they dared to share.